All right. Hey, so my name is James Burnham, and I've been working for President Trump in various ways since he went down the big, beautiful escalator in 2015, if you can believe that. At the time, I was one of the outside lawyers for his campaign. In Trump 45, I worked in the White House counsel's office in DOJ, and this time, as Inez said, I was general counsel of Doge. Maybe you've heard of it. It was pretty cool a little while ago. Anyway, in my years of public service, I've seen the full spectrum of executive power. In the beginning of 45, we were under immediate assault from the law enforcement industrial complex housed inside the executive branch. People remember this. That I would describe as a low point for presidential power. You all know the stories, so I won't belabor them, but I was in the meeting 6 days after President took office in 2017 when Sally Yates came to tell the counsel's office that they'd been spying on our national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and that the FBI had been in the White House interviewing him the night before. We spent the first 2 years of President Trump's first term fighting off that assault. Not this time. This time, President Trump took office understanding the full scope of his powers and was determined to restore the presidency to its rightful role in our constitutional order. I saw this firsthand at Doge, which I would submit is the most innovative tool for wielding executive power that the modern presidency has ever seen. From USAID to the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Doge teams worked with the president's cabinet to implement the president's directives quickly and capably and in line with his vision, and we've all seen the results. But I'm not here to tell war stories. We can do that later, maybe over a lot of drinks. I'm here to speak for a few minutes about the American presidency and its relationship with the courts. And to tell that story, I think we need to start at the beginning. It's easy to forget, but a great deal of time passed between the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It was 11 full years between the Declaration and the Constitution we have today. In that period, our forefathers won the Revolutionary War and ran a full field experiment with an extremely state-centric national government known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was basically government by committee, a unicameral national legislature comprised of delegates that each state legislature appointed. The national government had extremely limited power, and there was no president, as you would understand that concept today. Now, as anyone who has participated in a committee knows, decision-making by committee is a formula for failure. Perhaps that's why the universities are such a mess. Nothing gets done. There is no accountability. Everything stagnates. But fortunately, the founding generation figured this out, gathered in Philadelphia, and drafted the Constitution that governs us today. Now, the Constitution made many changes to the anemic Articles of Confederation, but I'm going to focus on one for today, the creation of the American presidency, which at the time was a unique office among nations. Now, in 1787, the framers had very few models for the government they sought to build. The direct democracy of Athens, the consul and senate system of pre-imperial Rome, there just wasn't a lot to go by back then. Now, from these scraps of history, they forged the American presidency. The president holds the only office in the United States elected by all the people. The president is the only official who is himself a branch of government, and the Constitution vests all executive power in the president's hands. Now, why did the framers do this, having recently fought a revolution to overthrow a monarch? Well, there's a lot of explanations, but here's mine. The framers had just seen how anemic and pathetic the nation was under the Articles of Confederation, and just as importantly, these men had learned what I think is an obvious lesson of history. The future of great nations and great peoples often depend on the vision of a single great leader, not the deliberations of a vast committee. Now, Alexander Hamilton summarized the point in one of the most famous passages in the Federalist Papers, which, given the topic today, I'm going to quote at some length. Quote, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy." Does this resonate today? Perhaps here in Washington, D.C.? Now, the topic today is not just the presidency, but also the courts. So once again, let's start at the beginning. What was the framers' vision for our judiciary? Well, to say that it was more modest than their vision for the presidency is a serious understatement. The framers wanted strong and independent judges, yes, but they wanted those judges to serve as a bulwark for individual liberty, not to serve as co-equals to the president or Congress in governing our nation. This is clear from the Constitution itself. It establishes a Supreme Court where the justices have life tenure, giving them independence, but it does not mandate lower courts, nor does it invest federal courts with the power to deem an act of Congress violative of the Constitution. That judicial power was far from clear until Chief Justice Marshall pronounced it many years later in Marbury versus Madison, which is easily the most consequential Supreme Court decision in American history. The limited role of the judiciary is also clear, I think, in the framers' arguments urging ratification of the Constitution. Now, there's several good passages from the Federalist Papers on this point, but I'm going to quote my favorite. And if there's any James Madison fans here, I'm sorry, but I'm going back to Hamilton. Hamilton wrote about the judiciary, in contrast to the executive or Congress, the judiciary, quote, has no influence over either the sword or the purse, no direction either of the strength or of the wealth of society, and can take no active resolution whatsoever. It may truly be said to have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and must ultimately depend upon the aid of the executive arm even for the efficacy of its judgments. Not force, not will, merely judgment. All right, so let's fast forward to today, well, almost to today, because I want to take one more detour before we get to today. So setting aside the tenure of President Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the nadir, the low point of presidential power in the United States, I think, is clearly the late and post-Nixon era. So reacting to the perceived misdeeds of President Nixon, which I think is a topic that is worthy of its own in-depth analysis and, dare I say, perhaps revisiting, Congress, it's the National Conservatism Conference. You can say that here. This is a safe space. Congress and the courts collaborated to sap the presidency of the robust powers it had long wielded. This is in the sort of late and post-Nixon era. Now, the list of terrible innovations is endless, okay? It includes the Impoundment Control Act, which we're hearing a lot about these days, the War Powers Act, which, pops up from time to time, and in my view, the worst innovation of them all, mostly gone now, thank God, the Ethics in Government Act, creating the so-called Independent Counsel. Now, these innovations were bad, and they came atop the Roosevelt-era enactment of the Administrative Procedure Act, which I actually think is one of the most consequential laws in modern American history. And the upshot of that is that it anointed so-called experts to make the rules that govern us all on behalf of the agencies where those experts work. Okay, so rather than have Congress or the president set policy directly, the law moved toward a devolution of power within the executive branch to the permanent bureaucracy. This means career officials who pursue their own conception of the public good because, they're experts. And of course, the median career government official's conception of the public good, you'll be shocked to hear, is an expansionist left-wing regulatory agenda that promotes liberal interests, expert interests, at the expense of our interests. The cumulative effect of these innovations is clear. It weakens the president at the expense of the executive branch he leads. Well, how has this all turned out over the last 40 years? Well, I'm happy to say to everyone here that the tide has turned. The presidency is back. In area after area, presidential control has been reasserted. You see this with so-called independent executive institutions, presidential control of administrative rulemaking, which the president has done some really cutting-edge stuff on, presidential control of the Justice Department, presidential control of how our money is specifically used, something near and dear to Doge. In all of these areas, President Trump is now vigorously asserting the prerogatives of his office. And he is doing so in the face of unprecedented resistance by the lower courts. TRO after TRO, injunction after injunction, many entered reflexively and without any real consideration of the issues presented. When I was at Doge, we had hundreds of lawsuits. We also had federal judges entering TROs ex parte. Okay, that means before the government has even had a chance to respond. I don't think that's ever happened in American history prior to this presidency. This is not normal. This is not normal behavior. And these are not cases about a deportation or something that's irremediable. We're talking about cases about grant money to universities, okay? Completely abnormal. Nor does it reflect the limited role of federal courts when it comes to reviewing, the president's administration of the executive branch he leads. And here's the other point, and this is not something that I think people fully appreciate. These temporary restraining orders, they sap the very energy the executive needs to be effective. Okay, each presidential term is 1,460 days. Every day matters. Wrongly shutting down a major executive branch initiative for 14 days, 28 days, 35 days, 45 days, whatever, that is a theft of those days from the elected president and the people who elected him. Every single day that he cannot act is a day of his term that has been stolen. And if it's wrong, it needs to be remediated quickly and completely. It also diverts the energy of the president's administration away from being energetic in the execution of his priorities to things like TRO compliance, litigation, and other non-productive tasks. I can tell you, when a TRO is entered, the cabinet secretary spends all their time worrying about how to deal with the court, as if the court is in charge of the agency, which is, of course, the absolute wrong way to be thinking about execution in the executive branch. Now, to its immense credit, I suggest that the Supreme Court has held firm. In order after order, the Supreme Court has stayed the worst offenses against the presidency, and I think they deserve a lot of credit for that. I believe that a strong majority of justices understands that Article 2 vests all executive power in the president. I further believe the justices will continue to enforce that fundamental principle as President Trump continues to assert his authority over the inner workings of the executive branch. We've all heard about and talked about and thought about the so-called unitary executive. Well, folks, now you're seeing it in action. This is it. Finally, I expect everyone here, I assume, supports the current president. If not, maybe you're at the wrong conference. So many of us are going to naturally celebrate his restoration of the constitutional order, right? But we should celebrate that restoration for reasons beyond the immediate issues of today. The American presidency is the greatest innovation in self-rule in modern history, and a vibrant, energetic executive is critical to lead us to future centuries of American greatness. Okay, just to survey our past, let's just consider a few examples. President Polk repelling the Mexican army from Texas in the Mexican-American War to assert our manifest destiny to rule over the American West. President Lincoln suppressing a rebellion by the southern states in the greatest threat our nation has ever faced. President Roosevelt crushing the Nazis in Imperial Japan following the shameful attack on Pearl Harbor. President Reagan staring down the communists in the Soviet Union at the Berlin Wall. President Bush rallying the nation after the greatest domestic attack since Pearl Harbor. And of course, President Trump coolly obliterating our nation's most bitter enemies from the skies before waking up the next morning and shooting 18 under par at Trump National. Time and again, when the nation is in turmoil, where have our people turned? To Congress? No. To the courts? Of course not. In times of trouble, Americans, indeed every person everywhere across the globe, turns to one place only. They turn to the American president. Our founding fathers left us an extraordinary birthright in the energetic executive we have today, but it is up to all of us to keep it. Thank you.